Hi, today I'm going to talk to you about some of the basics of Texas property division law. If you get a divorce in Texas and you don't have an agreement with your spouse about how the property is going to be divided, then the court is going to divide that property for you. By the end of this video, you'll understand just how it is that the court's going to divide that property. The court thinks of each piece of property that you own as fitting into one of three, what we'll call marital estates. You have the spouse's or the husband's separate marital estate, you have the wife's separate marital estate, and then you have the community estate. Any property that's considered community property is going to be divided by the court in a way that the court considers to be just and right, which is another way of saying that the property is going to be split in a way that the court considers to be fair. Any property that belongs to the husband and is deemed the husband's separate property is going to be divided to the husband without regard to what impact it has on the community estate. And any property that is going to be or is deemed to be the wife's separate property is going to be given to the wife without any regard to what impact that has on the community estate. So, for example, imagine that there's a married couple, a husband and wife, and the husband received a car from his parents prior to the marriage. And then after the marriage, the couple purchased a home. At the divorce, the car is going to be given to the husband, and then the house or the value of the house is going to be deemed separate property, and that property will be split between the husband and the wife in some way. So at this point, you may have realized that it's important to know what constitutes separate property and what constitutes community property. A spouse's separate property consists of property that's owned or claimed by the spouse before the marriage, property acquired by the spouse by gift, devise, or descent, the recovery for personal injuries that are sustained by a spouse, except for any recovery for the loss of earning capacity. Community property consists of any property other than separate property. Now, when you go to court and you're dealing with a property distribution issue, it's important that you understand there are going to be some presumptions that the court makes. One of the presumptions that the court makes is a presumption that we call the presumption of community property. And here's how the presumption of community property works. The idea is that property that's possessed by either spouse during or on dissolution of the marriage is presumed to be community property. And the degree of proof to which a person has to prove that the property is separate property, if that's what that person wants to prove, is clear and convincing evidence. So you hear about this idea of proving something beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what we usually hear about in a court and or on television. And then you hear about this concept called preponderance of the evidence. That's considered a very low standard, where you're just convincing the court that something is more likely than it is not likely. Well, in between those two things, beyond a reasonable doubt and preponderance of the evidence, is this degree of proof that we call clear and convincing evidence. Another concept that's important for you to understand is this concept that we call inception of title. The idea behind inception of title is that the character of the property is determined at the time that the right to own or claim the property arises. There are a couple of concepts that I can't really dig into in this particular video because it will make the length of the video longer than it's supposed to be. However, I want to tell you a couple of those concepts so that you know that the concepts exist. One concept applies to property that is purchased with money from a separate estate. And the way the case law reads on that is it says that where an asset is purchased with money that's traceable to a spouse's separate estate, the asset may appropriately be characterized as separate property. Let me give you an example. If your mother gave you $100,000 before you were married, and then after you were married, you used that $100,000 to purchase a house, you might be able to argue that the house is your separate property because the money is traceable to property or traceable to money that was part of your separate estate. Another concept is called reimbursement. Here's how reimbursement works. In Texas, we know that community property law is focused on distributing the community assets in a way that is just and right. But the law tries to account for a scenario in which one spouse may be entitled to reimbursement, even if the reimbursement results in what appears on the surface to be an unfair distribution of community property. Now, here's an example. The wife owns a family home prior to the date of the marriage. And during the marriage, the couple uses their shared income to make improvements on the property. So let's say they spend $20,000 in their shared income in making improvements on the property. Well, at the time of divorce, what would happen is the wife would get the house because it was her separate property. But because she gets the house, that creates the scenario in which she also would get that $20,000 worth of improvements. Well, the court recognizes, or the Texas Family Code recognizes that that's an unfair scenario. And so they try to address that through a concept that they call reimbursement. So under this concept of reimbursement, which is codified or available through the Texas Family Code, the court may choose to reimburse a spouse under 9 circumstances. Now, I've tried to go through this video without, and when rehearsing this or thinking about this, I tried to go through the video and provide the 9 circumstances, but it just added too much time to the video. So what I want to do is create another video that kind of digs in on those 9 reimbursement circumstances. So for now, the important thing that you need to know is that those circumstances exist. We've talked a lot about assets. I think it's also important that you recognize that community debts are something that are supposed to be split during the course of a marriage. So you're splitting community assets, but you're also splitting community debts. And one of the things that is important to keep in mind when dealing with community debts is that what the court orders with regard to the community debts has no impact on your obligation to other parties. So for example, you see this come up with banks and with mortgage companies. Just because you and your spouse are on the mortgage and the court says that your spouse is supposed to pay the mortgage, that doesn't mean that the mortgage company can't still go after you for your obligation to pay based on what you signed saying that you would pay. You won't be able to go to them and say, hey, but the court said that my spouse is supposed to pay that. And so that's an issue that people typically have to address in some way because the third party doesn't care what it is that the court said. It doesn't have anything to do with the third party. Another topic that I want to make sure I bring up through or during this presentation is this question of how you divide pensions and retirement plans. In particular, I want you to be aware of any employment benefits Social Security, military, or federal pensions. If you have to value a pension or a retirement plan, and that plan is a tax deferred savings plan or a tax deferred savings account, then you want to look to the value in the summary statement. To find the community share, you want to take the number of years or the number of married years that the employee spouse was part of the plan, and then divide it by the total number of years of employment when the marriage was dissolved. You can value it yourself. You can use an accountant. You can use a lawyer, but you also might want to consider using a professional actuary to address the issue. Now, there are a few ways that you can deal with federal pensions. There are waivers, trade-offs, and payoffs. And a discussion of those things is beyond the scope of what I can discuss in this particular video. If you have a federal pension or your spouse has a federal pension and you need to deal with that, then you want to talk to or call my office, schedule an appointment. I'll put a link in the description. I'm happy to talk to you about that particular issue, but it's a little too complex to discuss during this particular video. One thing that I want to make sure I discuss with you is something we call a QDRO, a Qualified Domestic Relations Order. A QDRO is an order that recognizes a right or the existence of an alternate payee's right to receive or assigns an alternate payee the right to receive all or the portion of benefits that are payable with respect to a participant under a retirement plan. And that includes certain information and meets certain other requirements. In other words, if one spouse works at a job and earns or earned a retirement benefit, but that spouse wants to or has to give that money to another person, then a QDRO is completed to direct the employer to give those benefits to that other person. If you have any questions or any concerns, you're welcome to schedule an appointment. I'm happy to speak with you about these issues, or you can post your concerns in the comments. I can respond much more efficiently if you schedule an appointment, but I'm happy to reach out to or respond to comments. Also, if you like what you've heard, then please be sure to press the like button and subscribe so that you can hear other information as I make it available. Thank you, and look forward to hearing from you. Take care.